Good evening, everyone. My name is Adekunle Benjamin Idris, and I'm a data governance and privacy manager. I've had so many questions coming from data governance and privacy professionals about the differences between data controllers and data processors. It sounds very much like an easy concept, but the truth is, it's not as easy as you think. Basically, you have to really understand um, understand the controllers and processors framework, because this remains a cornerstone of data protection. Basically, we're talking about data protection laws and then the fundamentals shaping how organizations approach GDPR compliance, basically. So compliance is the major issue here. We don't want to be caught short when we're shifting blames between controllers and processors. So this has made it expedient for me to share my knowledge with as much as possible people who might be having challenges with understanding the compliance responsibilities between processors and controllers. I have my phone number here and my email address in case you want to get through to me. Feel free to get in touch, and we'll be happy to discuss more. Just a minute. All right, so just to take you through the evolution of the core data protection concept, basically from the historical foundation, I would like to start just like I'm putting here in my projection. The concept of controllers and processors were originally established by the European data protection directives. Now, when you see the word directives, one, you might want to know what the difference, what the meaning of a directive is. Basically, a directive is just a legal instrument usually used within the European Union to bind member states to achieve a specific result. Now, a directive is actually an instrument, it's like a guide, and then allows member states to interpret the guides, leaving them with some sort of freedom to interpret it based on their local laws. But then again, they're given a limited period of time to interpret this and implement the directive. So a directive is like an instruction, but then again, it allows the member states to interpret it based on their local laws. And when we're talking about member states, we're talking about countries within the European Union. Now, under the GDPR, this definition remains fundamentally similar, providing continuity in data protection laws while adapting a modern reality. Now, the seemingly straightforward distinction has become increasingly nuanced in practice. Now, this seems to be very straightforward, but it's been a complex issue because of the interpretation of responsibilities between data processors and data controllers. Now, when we reflect on the sophistication of contemporary business operations, you'll begin to see why this has become very necessary for there to be set definition about the roles between the processors and the controllers. Now, you want to know what the modern complexities are, and I've done very well to just list a few here. Today, today's business environment presents unprecedented challenges. First of all, is the sophisticated outsourcing arrangements, which blurs the traditional boundaries. Now, the complications between regulations and then, of course, the ability for one organization to do several roles is becoming more complicated. For example, if you have like an application that requires people to be able to make payments, then you have to be making use of a payment gateway service provider who helps the company to receive monies from users of the application, for example. They've got different abilities, possibly the financial service provider or the API that will be integrated into the system, for example, might have passed through the regulatory requirement from, say, for example, the Financial Conduct Authority. But the IT company, for example, that has an application might find it very difficult to meet up with those regulations. I mean, it's going to be very expensive. So it becomes very necessary for them to seek the service of a financial service provider who integrates their API into the system. That's the kind of sophistication we're talking about. That's the kind of outsourcing arrangement that we're talking about. Now, when you have such outsourcing arrangement, the company that is supporting and providing financial services to the application company is now seen as a processor, while the company that has the application and is seeking the service, the processing of payments through the, let's say for example, Paystack, which is Paystack or Stripe, which is like a service payment gateway provider, would then be a processor. Now, the second complexity we'll be looking at is the centralized IT system complicates. IT system complicates jurisdiction questions. Now, we're talking about jurisdiction, we're talking about location. Basically, you're having sort of like the processor in England, and then you're having the controller, say, for example, in Japan. So definitely they have different jurisdiction. So the question comes, how then do we comply with the GDPR or whatever regulation that is functional in that location? So we'll be looking at that today. Then, of course, there's the complications of cloud computing, which has introduced multi-layer processing relationship that is easily understood, but then we'll go down to the global supply chain, which creates intricate data flow. We're talking here about cross-border data transfer. So how do we meet the requirements? The last and the second here seem to be very similar, but I'll break them down as we go forward. Now, despite these complexities, correctly identifying controllers and processors remains essential for protecting data subject rights and freedom, and also helping companies to remain compliant. Now, what is a data controller? Or I would say, who is a data controller? Now, a data controller could be a natural or legal person, could also be a public authority, agency, or any other body which alone or jointly with others determines the purpose. The key word here that we have to take note of is the word purpose. Purpose, is the word purpose. So determining the purpose and the means of processing of personal data. Yeah. So personal data, basically, that's a controller. Anyone who determines the purpose and the means of processing is a data controller. Now, let's go back to the example I was giving. I was talking about a mobile application company, call it X, for example, and X allows people to sort of like buy product on their systems. But now X does not have the ability to, the regulatory ability to take payments and perform KYC functions on people's cards. Talking about debit or credit card. For them to get this done, they have to seek the expertise of a company that has the ability to do that, that has done the regulatory requirements to provide such service. Now, X, which is a company that has the mandate or has determined why they need the service provider, the financial service provider, say for example Stripe, is now the controller, because X would actually determine the purpose why the need for Stripe to support them is necessary. So they've determined the purpose, and of course determining the processing. Okay, so how they want the processing to be, X would have to determine this to Stripe. This makes X, in this instance, a controller. Then we'll talk about the processor, okay? And of course, it's already clear. The processor definitely would be the service provider, in this case, Stripe, who will be coming to support X to process the data because they do not have the capacity, and X does not have the capacity to do so. Now, the controller is essentially the key decision maker regarding personal data. Now, we're talking about personal data of data subject. And when we mean personal data, it just means data of a natural person. Yeah, data of a natural person, basically, or of a data of a subject, data that can identify or is identifiable to the data subject. Now, this central role means that the GDPR compliance responsibilities rest squarely on the controller's shoulder, but not so worry, not fully, but squarely. So I'm going to explain that. Now, the controller isn't merely a passive custodian of data. Rather, it actively shares how and why and when personal data is processed. Now, understanding this role is fundamental because it determines where primarily accountability lies. When processing activities are scrutinized by regulators, or when data subject exercise the right. What this simply means is the controller has the full responsibility, basically, to fulfill the right of the data subject, and also to remain compliant to the regulatory body, or should I say the supervisory authority in the country. Okay, so it's the controller's responsibility to to be accountable to how data subject rights are fulfilled, and also how the the regulatory requirements are being complied with. Now, we'll be looking quickly at the controller's responsibilities under the GDPR. The first one is simple and clear. It's the first responsibility is the controller has the full and the sole responsibility to remain transparent. They have the transparency obligation, providing clear, accessible information to data subjects about processing activities, including privacy notice and fair processing information. This is basically going to be done through the privacy policy, either in the website or in the mobile application. So say, for example, the company X, who has provided a platform for people to buy products, must have to declare all the activities that will be done with the data of the service users. Also, how processing is going to be done. If at all there is a third party that will be involved in their data, you just have to be transparent. So it's the obligation of the controller to do that. Okay, it's the obligation of the controller to do that. Now, the second would be that the controller has the sole responsibility to fulfill the data subject rights. And when we talk about the data subject right, it's just like you can see here, honoring individuals' rights, including access to your data. Of course, we all know data subject rights, access to your data, rectification of data that seems to be incorrect or has changed, erasure. They have the right to erase their data from the controller system. Restriction, they have the right to stop you from further processing of their information. And of course, portability, they have the right to receive their data in a portable format, fair and portable format, not sending it to them in formats that they cannot access. And of course, objection to processing. So they have the right to object processing of their data. Okay, so it's the controller's responsibility to do that. Okay, now the security measures, it's also the controller's responsibility to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure data security commensurates with the risk level. So basically, one of the easiest way to do this truly is through the DPI, Data Protection Impact Assessment test. And of course, sometimes you would do the data maturity testing to check the level to which the organization is prepared to properly govern people's data. And of course, the DPIA is just to identify risks, risks areas relating to people's data, especially in sensitive data collection, mediums. Okay. Now, the fourth one here you can see is the lawful basis. Basically, one of the responsibilities of the controller is to ensure all processing has a legitimate legal basis, whether consent, contracts, yeah, we'll be talking about standard contractual clauses, and then, of course, legitimate interests or another lawful ground under Article 6. You can look at Article 6 from the GDPR, it's stated there. Then we'll go straight to the fifth responsibility would be impact assessment, just like we've talked about the DPIA, carrying out data protection impact assessment. Now, before I go in here, we should go back to number 3. When we talked about security measures, it has to do all about, we're talking about everything to do with security, cyber security, ensuring that there is no, ensuring that your backend and every area, every channel to which people's data can be leaked or breached are totally covered. And here you'll be dealing squarely with the IT technical team, and you should have some very strong technical team who ensures security measures are being put in place, and not just put in place, but also up to global standard, ensuring that people feel comfortable with having their data in your system. All right, so we'll go now to the data, to the impact assessments. Now we talk about the impact assessment. We'll be talking about carrying out data protection impact assessment tests, just like I said. Recently, what I do in practice is to make sure that my DPIA is very, very, very robust. So I look at the climate of the product, and then I check not only data related issues, but also political issues. I give you an example where I was conducting DPI in a company in Africa, and in that particular company, that particular country, there seemed to be a lot of physical insecurities relating to kidnap and all of those kind of things. So what I did was to ensure that I looked at the system to ensure that there is no loophole in the system that would require people to be easily kidnapped using the app, because that app was like a social media communication app, and then allows people to sort of communicate with each other. And looking at the political infrastructure, looking at the social infrastructure of the place, it's common for people to take advantage of systems. I'm talking about mobile application to communicate with people and facilitate other activities that are deemed unsafe for people. Another area I looked at while developing the DPIA is also looking at how to fulfill the child's rights and child protection in the area. So you as a data protection expert in any company, or data governance expert, if you're in the environment where you have to conduct DPIA, don't look squarely on data technicalities. You have to also cover the political realities in the country. So you have to be vast. You need to read, you need to watch the news, you need to know what is happening. Yeah. And this will really help you. Now, back to the data protection impact assessments. This has to be conducted when processing high risks, you're taking high risk operations on individual data. Basically, you should be looking at their rights and their freedom, and you need to assess these mediums, to identify if there are any risk, and how prepared you are, So basically, that's what it's used for. So it's the controller's duty to do that. Now, breach notification, very importantly, the controller is to determine whether notification to a data protection authority, supervisory authority, or data subject is necessary. Okay, following a personal data breach within strict timeframes. Now, this has to be in the data policy. Yeah, data privacy policies. You have to state your escalation, notification alerts, your sort of like how you remediate issues, how you address issues. Your documentation must be sharp, And of course, you have to have been prepared because when you make reports, then the supervisory authority begins to vet if you've done the right thing before that was done. Remember, it's better we plan before things happen so that we won't be seen as being negligent to the safety of data subjects. Okay, so we'll move to the next slide. Just try as much as possible to be quick. It's dead in the night, so I feel like sleeping. Now, the processor's role and obligation. I'm sure you've been waiting to understand what the processor's role actually is or are, because it seems like the controller is doing everything, isn't it? But that's not the case. Now, one would easily think, I had to put this topic here where I'm saying the processor is a subordinate but critical function. Not really a subordinate, just like it sounds, but basically it seems like that. But a processor is a person other than an employee of the controller. So the processor should not be an employee of the controller who processes personal data on behalf of the controller. Simple. Now, the processor occupies a subordinate position in the data protection hierarchy, basically, just because the processor reports to the controller on issues relating to data based on the contract that they're having. Now, processing data only on documented instructions from the controller. Now, a processor um, cannot take any action on the controller's data if they've not been a documented sort of contract or instruction from the controller. Now, the key processor's obligation includes ensuring international data transfer complies with GDPR requirements. Okay, now we're talking about within Europe, and of course, GDPR is like one of the most comprehensive data protection documents, regulatory guide globally. Okay, I found out that most countries are strongly aligned with the GDPR, but then they have, I mean, the processor has to ensure international data transfer complies with GDPR. We're talking about cross-border data transfer. This is another topic I'll be talking about if I continue creating or curating more lecture content like this. Now, the processor also has the obligation to implement appropriate security measures to protect personal data. This is a requirement for both the processor and the controller. Anyone dealing with anybody's data, whether it's a processor or a controller, you have to also make sure that your system is compliant. And as a matter of principle, which I'll be talking about, the processor also has the responsibility to check with the controller. The controller also has the responsibility to check with the processor to ensure that they also comply with international and the GDPR requirement. Okay, on security, and protection. Now, the processor also has the obligation to notify the controller promptly of any personal data breach. Okay, so this has to be in the contract. You have to clearly state this. If there's any data breach, the processor must promptly report this to the controller, who in turn will determine whether or not to report to the supervisory authority in the country or in the region, or also report to the data subject. All right. Now, maintaining one of another obligation is, for the processor, is to maintain records of processing activities. Any activity in data protection must be fully documented. If it's not documented, it doesn't exist. That's basically one of my mantra. If it's not documented, it just doesn't exist. Now, why processors have specific duties under the GDPR, we need to know that the controller remains the ultimate, or should I say remains ultimately liable for most aspects of the GDPR compliance. And also making the distinction between these roles are vital for risk management. I'm trying to be quick, Now, why do we have to correctly identify these rules? Why does this matter? Basically, it's for enforcement targets. Now, this very interestingly is if we identify the distinction between these rules, I'm talking about between the data controller and the data processor, it really aids enforcement targets. Now, what this just simply means, data processors are typically the first targets, sadly enough, of enforcement action by data protection authorities, you know, and then you just need to know that if there is any misidentification of the rules, this can really lead to unexpected regulatory scrutiny and potential sanctions. So if the processor does not really know their responsibility to the controller, and the controller is not informed when something happens, the controller cannot necessarily say, I am not aware. So that rule must be emphasized seriously. Now, we need to also understand why this also matters is that it helps to exercise the rights. Now, data subject needs to know who controls their data to effectively exercise their rights. Of course, controllers must be identifiable. All controllers must be identifiable. You need to let the data subject know who you are as a company or as an organization. And you must be accessible, yeah, accessible to individuals seeking to invoke their GDPR rights. So it has to be transparent. You have to put this in the policy and you need to signpost it for them to easily see. Okay, now the third reason why this matters is to manage liability allocation. Now, determining controller status is essential for establishing primary data protection responsibilities. Okay, so this affects insurance coverage, contractual indemnity, of course, financial exposure in breach scenarios. So basically what I'm saying here is we need to know who is the primary responsible party to determine if there's any liability. So where are we allocating it to? Basically, as simple as that. Now, member state discretion. Now, in cases where GDPR gives member states discretion to implement additional legislation, the controllers location may trigger supplementary requirements beyond core GDPR obligations. So basically what this just means is if the controller is, say for example, out of the GDPR jurisdiction, then additional requirements might be required. I mean, should I say requirements was required, but of course, there should be additional requirements that must be added to the GDPR obligations. Okay. Now, the last reason why this matters is the supervisory or authorities jurisdiction. Now, the location and identity of the controller determines which supervisory authority has responsibility for overseeing the data processing activities, particularly relevant for cross-border processing. So, of course, we need to know who the processor is and then who the controller is, and of course, what region, where are they, and then of course, identify the right supervisory authority that should be sort of like, supervising the activities of data protection in that region. All right. All right. So distinguishing controllers and processors. I'm sure I've done a good job already distinguishing this, but then of course, I'll just go through this so to make it clearer. Now, the critical question here is who determines the purpose or the purposes of which personal data are being collected, stored, used, altered, and disclosed, basically. Now, controllers' characteristics and of course processors' characteristics. I'll start with the controllers. Controllers possesses the authority to make fundamental decisions about data processing. Easy. Now, of course, this means determining why data is collected. We're talking about the purpose here. And also deciding what data is collected. We're talking about the scope. And also establishing how data is processed. We're talking about the means. And of course, setting retention period and deletion protocols. This has to be in the privacy policy. How long do you keep people's data? How long do you keep it even after after they've opted out of the service? How long do you still keep setting data in case it's requested to be deleted? Those has to be clearly spelled out in terms of transparency. And of course, your deletion protocols. What are the steps to get data deleted? Now, the last here for the characteristics of a controller is also that the controller decides on the disclosures to third party. Basically, is there any third party you're disclosing data to? You have to also make that clear, okay? But of course, also disclosing issues like bridges to authorities, and of course to the service providers also. That has to be the controller's characteristics. Now we go now to the characteristics of the processor. Now the processor simply acts on behalf of a controller within defined parameters. Okay, now we're talking about the first one here is processing only undocumented instruction. Remember, as a processor, you only process on the instruction. Clear contract between the processor and the controller. And then again, the second characteristics would be no independent authority over purpose or essential means. So the controller has no right to independently decide the purpose to which the data will be used, or the means to which the data can be processed. Now, the third one here is typically a service provider's relationship. Basically, that's it. So the processor is like a service provider. Now, remember the example I've given between the app development company called X and, of course, the financial service provider called Stripe. So, of course, in this instance, Stripe would be a service provider to X. Easy, very easy. Now, the fourth characteristics would be the processor is bound by contractual obligation to the controller. Simple, just contractual obligations, nothing more, nothing less. Now, the last here would be limited discretion on implementation details only. So the controller does not have to have the processor does not need to have unnecessary information about the data subject. That's it. Now, finally, it's crucial to note that the same organizations can be a controller for some processing activities and a processor for others, depending on the specific context and relationship. So that's clear. So you could, as an organization who is a controller to another, to, let's say, for example, a processing company to you, you also can also be a processor to another company. I would like to think of an example. Say, for example, um, hmm, you have a website that collects bookings, for residents who want to stay in your hotel, and then you're using Stripe again as your payment gateway to get payments from clients, Now you're a processor, you're a controller to Stripe. But at the same time, if you collect information, if the application company, say for example the website company called X again, um, helps hotels to collect information, collect data from residents who would be living in their hotels. Now the website company now is a processor for the hotels that they service, if you get what I mean. So the website company is a processor to the hotels who puts their hotels in the system and uses their website to get bookings. Yeah. and then give them the information for the data for them to use to facilitate the preparation of the hotel accommodation. But also, this same website company is still a controller to the financial service provider that processes data for them. I mean, processes payments for them by collecting data from the, say, for example, the cards, debit or credit cards. That's basically what it means. All right. Now, the GDPR definition of controller, yeah, is very, very straightforward. Now, we'll be looking at Article 4.7 of the GDPR, which defines controllers as the natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which alone or jointly with others determine the purposes and means of the processing of personal data, where the purposes and means of such processing are determined by union or member state law. Okay. The controller or the specific criteria for its nomination may be provided by union or member states. So simple, I would explain this as we go. Now, this definition encompasses several key elements that requires careful analysis. Okay, I had to put it this way because it's not so it's clear, but it needs a little bit of more analysis and explanation. Now, the European Data Protection Board has provided detailed guidance through guidelines 07/2020 on the concept of controller and processor. This has been very serious issues. So, of course, the guidelines, clear guidelines were developed to just make this very clear and easy to understand, which clarifies how these principles apply in practice. Now, these guidelines identify 5 main building blocks within the controller definition, an expansion from the 3 building blocks previously identified by the Article 29 Working Party. Now, the European Data Protection Board expressly confirms that the underlying concepts have not changed and the criteria for attributing roles remain fundamentally the same. I'm going to explain this as we move further. Now, the 5 building blocks, okay, that determines the controller status. This is the place where I would be able to explain properly. First one, the controller must be a natural legal person, okay? Public authority or agency or other body. Okay, so the controller, that's very broad. Could be a person, could also be an organization, could be a body, that's a controller. Now, this establishes who can be a controller, which is, of course, a broad category that encompasses individuals, companies, public bodies, and various organizational forms. Now, the controller must be a legal entity capable of bearing rights and obligation. That's the key word there. The controller has to be a legally sort of like structured entity that has the capacity of bearing rights, fulfilling the rights of data subject, and of course the obligations to data subject. Now, number 2 is determines. Now, we're talking about just the definition being broken down into building blocks. Now, we've talked about the natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body that determines. So here the building block now is determine. This refers to the exercise of decision making. Okay, we're talking about decision making power over personal data processing. So once you function within the purview of making decisions about people's data, personal data, of course, that's now making you a processor. I mean, a controller, sorry to say. Of course, you have the you have the obligation to determine the means having the actual influence and the factual power to decide where merely theoretically or normally or nominal authority. What this just simply means is that you just really have the obligations to dictate theoretically or in practice how and the means to which data are being processed. Now, the focus is on substantive control, not just formal designation. So it's not just delegating to say, yes, you can do this, but of course, you have a practical substantive control. Okay. Now the third one is we're looking at the third building block, which is if we move now to say the controller determines alone or jointly with others. Now, controllers may act independently or share controllers' responsibilities with other entities. Yes, jointly, this is called joint controllership, which can arise when two or more controllers jointly determines the purpose and means, requiring careful consideration of the arrangement and allocation of responsibilities. Now, what this just simply means is two companies, two people, or two, bodies, agencies can come together to determine how they want to use data. This usually happens when there is a partnership partnership in business, and of course they have decisions to make together on how to process personal data of their data subject. Now, the fourth one is the purpose and means. We've talked about determining together or jointly or alone, but of course, the purpose and means. Here, we're talking about the purpose refers to why processing, so the why of processing. Now, the intended outcome or objective, which means how we're talking about the method and manner of processing, determining both purpose and essential means is the hallmark of controller status. So once you can determine the purpose and the means of processing personal data of data subjects, that is pointing at you as a controller. Now, the last here would be now, the purpose and means, the last now is now going to say of the processing of personal data. So you must be processing personal data of a natural person. Okay. Now, this defines the scope as controller status applies specifically to personal data processing. Now, the determination must relate to operations performed on personal data, whether automated or manual, structured or unstructured. As long as you're processing personal data, that makes you data controller. Whoa, this is difficult, but I'm just going to try my best. Now, practical application of data protection. Practical application for data protection professionals. So we're just going to look at how to apply data protection as a professional. Now, moving from theory to practice. I hope this topic makes sense. I'm just putting things together in my head and hoping to share my experience. Now, for data protection and governance professionals, understanding controller and processor distinction is not merely an academic exercise. It is fundamental to operationalizing the GDPR compliance within your organization. Now, the first is, if you want to get this done, conduct regular assessments, systematically reviewing processing activities. This is fundamental for both data processors and data controller. Always ensure you conduct regular assessments by systematically reviewing processing activities to correctly identify controller and processor roles. So this has to keep going. You have to keep doing this to identify the roles in case anything has changed, particularly when onboarding new vendors, okay, or launching new products and services. Once you are seeking the service of a processor as a controller, you must determine, you must conduct like an assessment to identify your roles, and also processors will have to also be interested in assessing the roles of the controllers. Okay. Now, the second is draft appropriate contracts. Ensure that you draft appropriate contract. Now, ensure processors agreement contains all Article 28 requirements, clearly delineating responsibilities. You have to spell those out, instructions and obligations to protect your organization and comply with GDPR mandates. So basically, in that contract, you have to spell everything out there. You must spell out the responsibilities, the instructions, the obligations to protect your organization and to comply with GDPR mandates. Those must be spelled out. Now, the third year would be, we're talking about in practice now, the third would be document determinations. Now, basically, what we mean here is just maintain clear records of how controller processors determinations were made. So how did you come about determining that you're the controller and then they are the processors, okay? Now, including the rationale and the factors considered, okay, to demonstrate accountability to supervisory authorities. The key word here is demonstrating accountability because I tell you, if anything goes wrong, supervisory authorities will ask for documents. Okay, so you want to be able to show that you've done your due diligence. Sometimes even emails can really help. Okay, now establish clear governance. Okay, now implement internal processes for identifying and managing controllers and processors relationship, including escalation procedures escalation procedures when determination, are unclear and disputed, ensuring legal and business terms align. So basically, you must set out clear governance to avoid issues. But of course, if they happen, how do you address them? Okay, because sometimes there could be blame shifting, where processors are saying this your responsibilities, and of course, controllers are saying this would be your responsibility. So how do we govern ourselves in case there is any form of dispute or disagreement? Now, by mastering this fundamental concept, data protection professionals can effectively allocate responsibilities, okay? Manage risk, ensure their obligations ensure the organization meets the obligations under the GDPR while protecting individuals' fundamental rights to privacy and data protection. So basically, that's simple. That's it. So partnering for data protection excellence, basically a precise understanding of the distinction between these roles and responsibilities of data controllers and processors is not merely a legal formality. It is the cornerstone of effective GDPR compliance and robust data protection. So by diligently identifying roles, documenting determinations, which of course I've talked about, drafting comprehensive contracts, and establishing clear governance, organizations can foster collaborative environments where data privacy is paramount, safeguarding individuals' rights, and building trust. Thank you. So please feel free to tell me how I've done today. I'm just trying to keep this up and share my experience, share what I've been doing as a data governance and data protection manager. Feel free to drop your comments. If there's any area you need me to improve, do well to let me know. And I'll see you in the next session. If at all, I would move on with doing this again. But I hope I do it again. Thank you very much. Bye.